Betrayal doesn't start the moment someone decides to leave. It starts long before, with lies, with secrecy, with quiet meetings that can still be excused, until they can't. I thought I knew my wife. Until one night, she looked me in the eyes and lied. Hours later, I was following her, knowing the truth would destroy everything. But if someone thought they could take what was mine, they had no idea who they were dealing with. The weight of the Glock felt familiar in Eric's hand as he methodically cleaned it, a ritual that usually brought him a sense of order. Tonight, however, the usual comfort eluded him. Something was wrong. The silence in the house felt unnatural, stretching into the corners of his home office like an unseen force pressing down on him. Claire should have been home by now. A quick glance at his watch confirmed the creeping suspicion, 9:15 p.m. She had mentioned working late, but this was beyond her usual hours. The last-minute cancellation of their dinner plans had seemed innocent enough at first, but now, in the quiet of the night, doubt settled deep in his chest. Reaching for his phone, he dialed her number. It rang unanswered before cutting to voicemail, her recorded voice chirping through the speaker as if mocking his unease. He didn't leave a message. Instead, he stood, pacing the length of the office, the familiar weight of suspicion coiling in his gut. Claire was meticulous, reliable, never one to ignore a call, never one to let him wonder. Something wasn't right. Without another thought, he grabbed his keys and left the house. The drive to Claire's office was a blur, each passing streetlight illuminating the storm brewing in his mind. Scenarios played out in rapid succession, each more unsettling than the last. The more he tried to rationalize her absence, the more the unanswered questions gnawed at him. Pulling into the parking lot of the towering corporate building, his unease deepened. Claire's car wasn't there. The usual spot where she parked remained empty, the surrounding lot nearly deserted. A few scattered vehicles lingered in the dim glow of overhead lamps, but none of them hers. Inside the building, the night security guard glanced up as Eric entered. The man recognized him. This wasn't the first time Eric had come to pick Claire up. The nod of acknowledgement was automatic, though it carried the slight hesitation of uncertainty. She should have still been here. Instead of asking questions, Eric took the elevator up to the 15th floor, the ride stretching unbearably long. When the doors finally opened, darkness greeted him. Most of the offices were locked, vacant. Only a single sliver of light spilled from beneath the conference room door at the end of the corridor. Approaching, he paused, listening. Silence. No voices, no movement, just the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Pushing open the door, he stepped inside. The room was empty. A half-drunk cup of coffee sat abandoned on the long conference table, accompanied by scattered papers left in disarray. Someone had been here recently. But not anymore. His phone was in his hand before he even registered dialing the number. The groggy voice on the other end hesitated before answering his question. Claire had left at 6:30. Said she had dinner plans? The response barely registered as the cold certainty took hold of him. She had lied. The drive home was quieter than before. No blaring thoughts, no frantic explanations, just a steady, simmering awareness of the truth taking shape in his mind. When he pulled into the driveway, the house loomed before him in darkness. No sign of Claire's car. He remained seated, gripping the steering wheel, eyes locked on the empty space where she should have parked. It wasn't just a schedule mix-up. It wasn't just work. There was something else, something she wasn't telling him. Time crawled. Then, headlights cut across the driveway. Claire's car rolled in behind his. Eric stayed motionless as she stepped out, her movements deliberate, almost hesitant. Even from a distance, he could see it, the smudged makeup, the slight dishevelment of her usually pristine appearance. The way her fingers gripped the strap of her purse a little too tightly. She approached the house without noticing him at first. When she finally turned, her surprise was evident. A thin excuse passed her lips. Something about her phone dying, about long meetings, about the exhaustion of the day. But the words barely registered. He was focused on the details. The way she avoided his gaze. The way her breath hitched just slightly between sentences. The lie sat between them, thick in the air. Without a word, he gestured toward the house. They needed to talk. And he needed the truth. The silence inside the house felt different now, heavier, as if the weight of unspoken words filled every inch of space. Claire moved carefully, setting her purse on the counter, her fingers lingering over the strap as if stalling. The air between them was thick with an unspoken tension, a quiet battle neither had yet to declare. Eric leaned against the doorframe, watching her. His training had taught him to read people in ways they didn't even realize, and right now, everything about Claire's posture screamed unease. The stiffness in her shoulders, the way her breathing was just a fraction too controlled, the avoidance of his gaze, it was all there. She wasn't just exhausted. She wasn't just coming home late from work. The question was how much of the truth she was willing to admit. The hours before this moment played in his mind like a reel of evidence. Her absence. The missing car. The assistant's words, confirming she had left hours ago for supposed dinner plans. But where? With whom? The pieces formed an ugly picture, one that he wasn't ready to finalize without confirmation. Claire turned, finally meeting his gaze, though her expression was carefully composed. "I know I should have called," she said, voice measured, rehearsed. "Things just got out of hand at work. My phone was dead, and I lost track of time." A simple excuse. Too simple. Eric said nothing at first, letting the silence stretch, watching as her fingers fidgeted against the countertop. The moment was delicate, too much pressure, and she'd retreat into defensive explanations. Too little, and she'd slip past him with more lies. He exhaled slowly, keeping his voice steady. "You weren't at the office." A flicker of hesitation. A slight shift in weight. A split second too long before she responded. "What?" "You weren't at the office," he repeated, his tone unchanged. "Your assistant said you left at 6:30. Her lips parted, but no words came immediately. The calculation was visible, the effort to construct a new explanation, to find a gap in his knowledge. But she wasn't fast enough. Finally, she forced a weak smile. "I must have forgotten to mention, I had dinner with a colleague. It was last minute, and I didn't want to bother you." Another lie. He could feel it in the way she spoke, the way she tried to soften her expression, as if her body itself was rejecting the falsehood. Eric had spent years interrogating people who were desperate to hide things. He knew the tells. The minute shifts in behavior. And Claire was crumbling. Still, he said nothing, letting the silence press down on her. The longer it stretched, the more restless she became. "It wasn't a big deal," she added, her voice tightening slightly. "I don't understand why you're upset." A strategic deflection, redirecting his focus, shifting blame. But Eric wasn't taking the bait. Instead, he finally moved, stepping away from the doorframe and closing the distance between them. "Who was it?" Claire blinked. "What?" "The colleague. What's their name?" Another hesitation. Then, the cracks became impossible to hide. Her breast shallowed, and the false confidence she had been clinging to slipped away. "Eric, this is ridiculous." She let out a strained laugh, but it was empty. "Why are you interrogating me like this?" His eyes stayed locked on hers, unwavering. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need anger. The truth was already unraveling between them, exposed by her own reluctance. Her gaze faltered first. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, barely above a whisper, "Marcus." The name hit like a trigger pulled in slow motion. Eric's breath remained even, but inside, a shift occurred. Marcus. The man she had mentioned before. The one whose name had come up in passing, always in a way that felt dismissive, unimportant. The executive she had subtly defended in conversations, though Eric had barely noticed at the time. Now it all clicked. The extended work hours. The shift in her attention. The way she had started dressing differently for the office. The way she had begun carrying her phone with her at all times, guarding it like a secret. A slow, steady nod was all Eric gave in response. No accusations? No outbursts. Just quiet understanding. Claire's shoulders dropped, her arms wrapping around herself as if trying to hold in the weight of her own confession. "It's not what you think," she murmured, but even she didn't sound convinced. Eric wasn't sure how long he stood there, letting the reality sink in. The ache of betrayal was dull but persistent, settling in his bones. He wanted to ask how long. He wanted to ask why. But those questions wouldn't change what was already evident. His wife had lied to him. And whatever had been going on with Marcus, however far it had gone, it was enough for her to hide it. Enough for her to break something between them that might never be repaired. The walls of the home that had once been their sanctuary now felt foreign, like a space occupied by strangers. Eric finally exhaled, the weight of the night pressing against him. "I think you should go to Emily's for a few days." Claire's eyes shot up, wide with disbelief. "What?" "We need time to think." His voice remained steady, though every word felt heavier than the last. "Take a bag. I'll call her and let her know you're coming." Her lips trembled as she processed his words. For a moment, she looked like she might argue, might try to plead. But instead, she simply nodded. Without another word, she turned and made her way upstairs. Eric remained where he was, listening to the distant sound of drawers opening and closing. Minutes later, Claire descended, a small suitcase in hand, her face pale and drawn. She hesitated by the door, her voice barely above a whisper. "I love you, Eric." He didn't respond. As the door closed behind her, silence returned to the house. But this time, it was different. This time, it was the kind of silence that came after something irreversible. Something broken. The house was silent. Not the comfortable silence of solitude, but an empty, hollow quiet that settled deep into the walls. The kind of silence left behind after something irreversible. Eric sat at his desk, staring at the surface without really seeing it. The memory of Claire leaving replayed in his mind, the sound of the zipper on her suitcase, the weight in her eyes before she walked out, the way the door closed just a little too softly, as if she wasn't sure she wanted to go. None of it mattered now. What was done was done. The weight of betrayal was not unfamiliar to him. In his years of gathering intelligence, he had seen deception in its many forms: covert deals, silent betrayals, unspoken agreements. The only difference now was that the battlefield had shifted. This wasn't some nameless operative or foreign contact. This was Claire. His wife. His hand hovered over his phone for a moment before he made the call. The voice on the other end answered without surprise. No small talk. No pleasantries. Just a simple question, direct and efficient. "What's the job?" Eric leaned back in his chair, already laying out the plan in his mind. He needed movement patterns. Communications. Meetings. A complete record. The request was met with a familiar efficiency, a brief acknowledgement, an estimated time frame. By the time the call ended, the process was already in motion. He placed the phone back on the desk and exhaled, slow and measured. This was no longer about emotions. It was about clarity. Understanding the full extent of the situation before deciding what came next. The night stretched long, but sleep never came. His body went through the motions: coffee, a workout, a shower, all mechanical, all distant. The mind, however, remained sharp, locked onto the next step. By morning, the first updates arrived. Claire's movements had been tracked, her routines mapped. Office at 8. Gym by 6. 2 scheduled dinner meetings a week. That night, a reservation had been made. Private table. 2 guests. Her name was on the list. So was his. Marcus Gray. The confirmation felt cold. Expected, yet still carrying a weight that settled somewhere beneath the surface. The pieces had fallen into place. There were no more doubts. Eric stood, retrieved his keys, and left the house. Tonight, he would have his answers. The night carried a strange, almost oppressive stillness. The hum of the city continued as usual, cars moving along dimly lit streets, neon lights reflecting off wet pavement, but for Eric, everything else faded into the background. His focus was locked on one thing, the entrance to the restaurant. From his vantage point inside the car, he remained still, observing. He had done this countless times before, waiting for targets to reveal themselves, gathering information before taking action. The difference now was that the subject of his surveillance wasn't an enemy or a stranger. It was Claire. She arrived first, stepping out of a sleek black car. Even from a distance, Eric noted the tension in her movements. The way she hesitated before smoothing down her dress, the way her eyes flicked around as if scanning her surroundings. It wasn't the poise of someone meeting a colleague for a professional dinner. It was something else. Then, right on schedule, Marcus Gray appeared. His arrival was different. Confident. Relaxed. As if he had nothing to hide, no hesitation in his steps. He moved toward Claire with a familiarity that set Eric's teeth on edge. The way he placed his hand on the small of her back as they entered the restaurant wasn't overt, but it wasn't nothing either. It was the kind of touch that tested boundaries, calculated, deliberate. Eric waited. Patience had always been a virtue of his, and tonight was no exception. Inside the restaurant, he knew they would be seated in a quiet corner, away from wandering eyes. The reservation had been set up for privacy, a detail that only confirmed what he already suspected. For nearly an hour, he sat in silence, watching through the restaurant's large glass windows. He didn't need to hear the conversation to know how it played out. The body language was enough. Marcus leaned in slightly, his expression unreadable yet practiced, the way a man in control of the situation always appeared. Claire's posture was different, her shoulders drawn, her fingers tightening subtly around the stem of her wine glass. She wasn't relaxed. That was the only thing keeping Eric from acting immediately. If she were at ease, if she leaned into the moment, if she smiled the way she used to smile at him, then maybe he would have driven away. Maybe he would have let the inevitable happen. But she wasn't. She was uncomfortable, uncertain. And that meant she hadn't fully crossed the line yet. When they finally left, Eric remained motionless, his grip tightening on the steering wheel as he watched the scene unfold. Outside the restaurant, Marcus walked Claire to her car. The moment stretched longer than it should have. They spoke in hushed voices, the space between them thin, fragile. Marcus reached for her arm, just a brief touch, fingertips against fabric. Claire didn't pull away immediately, but she didn't lean into it either. She lingered. Then, after a moment of hesitation, she nodded once, almost as if answering an unspoken question. And then, without another word, she turned, got into her car, and drove away. Eric didn't follow her. Not tonight. There was no need. Instead, he stepped out of his vehicle, his movements unhurried, his pulse steady. The time for gathering information was over. Now, it was time to act. Marcus had only just turned toward his own car when he sensed Eric's approach. At first, his expression remained neutral, but as Eric stepped into the glow of the streetlight, recognition flickered across his face. "Mr. Devlin," Marcus greeted, smoothing down his tie, his voice easy. Controlled. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight." Eric didn't answer immediately. He let the silence settle, the weight of his presence pressing into the space between them. Marcus shifted slightly, adjusting his stance, though his confidence never wavered. He was good at this, keeping control, maintaining an air of superiority. But Eric had met men like him before. He had broken them before. "You think you're untouchable," Eric said finally, his voice calm, measured. Marcus exhaled through his nose, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "I think you might be overreacting. A business dinner is hardly cause for concern." Eric's gaze didn't waver. "Is that what you told her?" Marcus smirked, tilting his head slightly. "I don't tell Claire anything. She makes her own decisions." There it was. The test. The subtle way Marcus tried to shift the blame, to provoke, to see how far he could push. Eric didn't take the bait. Instead, he took a step closer, his voice lowering just enough to cut through the false civility. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he said, quiet but firm. For the first time, Marcus hesitated. Just slightly. But Eric saw it. The way his fingers twitched, the slight shift in his expression. He wasn't used to being challenged. Eric leaned in just enough to make his presence unmistakable. "This ends tonight," he said. "There won't be another dinner. There won't be another conversation. Whatever you think is happening, it stops now." Marcus met his gaze, the cocky arrogance faltering, if only for a second. Then, as if regaining control, he smirked again. "You don't get to make that decision for Claire." Eric let the silence stretch again. Let the words sink in. Then he smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not a forced one. But the kind of smile that made men rethink their choices. "I don't have to," he said simply. Marcus opened his mouth as if to respond, but the weight of the moment made him reconsider. He wasn't stupid. He knew what this was. And he knew what kind of man he was dealing with now. Without another word, Eric turned and walked away. The message had been sent. Now, it was only a matter of whether Marcus was smart enough to listen. The house felt heavier than before. Every corner carried a lingering weight, an unspoken presence of everything that had unraveled in the past days. The walls had absorbed the silence, stretched thin between suspicion and the cold realization of betrayal. Eric sat at the dining table, unmoving, hands resting on the polished wood. The waiting didn't bother him. He had spent years mastering patience, learning how to sit in silence until the right moment to act presented itself. This was no different. Outside, a car rolled into the driveway. Moments later, the door opened, the quiet shuffle of steps reaching his ears before she even entered the room. Claire moved cautiously, as if stepping into unfamiliar ground, though this was her home. The pause at the threshold lasted longer than necessary. She had known this was coming. The dim light overhead cast uneven shadows across her face. Her expression carried exhaustion, not just from the night, but from something deeper, something that had been unraveling long before tonight. Her bag slipped from her shoulder onto the counter, fingers trembling slightly as she exhaled. It was almost imperceptible, but he caught it. A nervous energy lingered in her stance, the careful way she braced herself for what was inevitable. Eric remained still. No questions. No accusations. Just the weight of the truth pressing into the silence between them. There was no need for drawn-out explanations. He had been there outside the restaurant. He had watched as Marcus leaned in, as Claire hesitated, as something unsaid passed between them in the lingering seconds before she walked away. She had expected confrontation. Maybe even anger. But he gave her neither. Instead, the silence stretched, forcing her to be the first to break. A slow, shaky breath. A step closer, but still hesitant. The confession was quiet, almost resigned. She hadn't planned for this. Hadn't intended for things to go this far. At first, it had been nothing. Just work. Just conversation. Then, without her realizing it, something had shifted. Lines blurred, intentions twisted into something she wasn't sure how to define. It hadn't been about love. Not about wanting to leave. It had been about something else entirely. About feeling seen in a way she hadn't noticed she was missing. But none of it changed the fact that she had lied. Eric listened, absorbing every word, every pause where she hesitated, choosing what to admit and what to hold back. The weight of her guilt sat between them, thick and suffocating. He finally exhaled, slow and measured. The damage had already been done. There were no quick fixes, no apologies that could erase the past days. Trust, once fractured, didn't mend overnight. She wanted to fix this. That much was clear. But wanting wasn't enough. Eric stood, pushing the chair back with deliberate slowness. His movements were steady, composed, but the finality in them was unmistakable. Nothing about this would be easy. If they were going to move forward, there could be no shortcuts, no avoidance of the hard truths. And Claire understood. The hesitation in her posture gave way to something else: resolve. Whatever came next, it would be a long road. But neither of them was ready to walk away just yet.